Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special new Directions in Scholarship episode or a podcast, depending where you're watching us or hearing us, devoted to the ICONAS Book Prize, where we celebrate scholarship so good that it survived multiple committees, multiple reviewers, and of course, we celebrate stamina of the author to actually be here with us. I'm so very much delighted to be here with Natasha Wheatley, who not only pushed the boundaries in the field, but she actually redrew them. I like to think of this as the Oscars of public law, only with more citations and maybe less funding for the red carpet, maybe. So thank you for joining us for this celebration of idea and maybe occasional nerdy arguments that we're going to have in this episode. So Natasha Wheatley received the ICONAS Book Prize 2025 at the ICONAS conference in Brazil. She's sharing the first place actually with Sandipta Dasgupta. My colleague Rehana Beratne actually did the interview with another counterpart. I'm doing the interview as a co-chair of the Committee of New Directions. My name is Maya Saharic. I'm doing the interview with Natasha Wheatley. Let me introduce you, Natasha. Natasha is an associate professor in the Department of History at Princeton University, and she works on modern European and international history with broad interest in intellectual and legal history, Central Europe, and the history of international law. Her first book, The Life and Death of States, Central Europe, and the Transformation of Modern Sovereignty, the book that we are going to discuss today, was published by Princeton University Press in 2023. But she is also co-editor of Power and Time, Temporalities in Conflict, and the Making of History, but also Remaking Central Europe, the League of Nations, and the former Habsburg lands. She has held fellowships in Berlin, Vienna, Cambridge, and Sydney, and her writing has appeared in Past and Present, Law and History Review, History and Theory, Slavic Review, and the London Review of Books, and the New York Times. Speaking about the life and death of states, my impression was that it focuses really on the region of Central Europe, of course, especially on the territories of the Habsburg Empire, over roughly a century of transformations, I guess. But it traces really the intellectual history of sovereignty, statehood during this period, and how states are born, how they die, emerge, split, and how legal and constitutional ideas evolve around these processes. And Natasha used the Habsburg Empire as a laboratory for modern ideas of the state. And I think because it was a multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-jurisdictional polity, it actually challenged us or challenged the usual model of a singular state within this exclusive sovereignty. So welcome, Natasha.
Thank you so much, Maya. It's a great pleasure to be here.
First question for you. Speaking about the book, what are the main claims? I just said a few things about my impressions of the book, something that I've read on the back covers and so on. But what are the main claims of the book from you?
It's true. I think you've done a wonderful job summarizing those claims. But just sort of to put perhaps a slightly different gloss on it, I do think the main contention of the book is the idea that Central Europe is actually a really pivotal place from which to think about and to understand the history of the modern state. And in particular, this process of the transformation of a world of multinational empires into a world of putative nation states, which must count as the sort of, key international transformation of the 20th century, really, sort of hard to underestimate in its sort of structural importance for the history of international order and, for our map of the world today. So it sort of, asserts that we've played a lot of perhaps even an undue emphasis on the British and French imperial worlds, to the extent that we tell this story about empire and statehood and so on. It's very much in relationship to those polities, these sort of blue water maritime empires. But it really wants to make this forceful case that in Central Europe, you not only see this sort of laboratory for statehood, as you say, a constant discussion about what the parameters of state and sovereignty are in this conglomerate multinational empire, and then even after the Habsburg Empire collapses, huge debates about the states that follow in its wake, which are then, redebated and reoccupied and reborn again through the Second World War. So you have this constant sort of flux and uncertainty about aligning peoples and borders and forms of sovereignty that these polities could take. And so I want to show the way in which both inside the empire and also beyond it, this region was really, a laboratory for making states, but also for making modern legal thought. Because essentially so many of the key building blocks of public international law, to some extent also just public law in general, were really forged in the Habsburg lands in the decades before and after the empire's collapse. So there are, the really big names, people like Hans Kelsen, of course, Georg Jelinek, but also people like Hersch Lauterpacht and Eugen Ehrlich, who's now been sort of revived as this key theorist of legal pluralism, and many others. And so I think that's not an accident that this area is disproportionately represented in our public law canons. Because law held an existential significance in these lands. Everyone who was anyone was trying to solve the problem of the state in Habsburg Central Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so the book tries to recover why that was the case and show the consequences for thought that very much continue into the present in our contemporary theories of sovereignty.
Two follow-up questions. So the first one is actually related to what you say, to what you mentioned as constant flux, uncertainty, dynamics, and so on. I'm very much interested, how do you build a methodology around this? So how do you choose your methodology? What was your methodology in this book, given, the complexity of the topic?
Yeah, great question. I think there are a few different things going on methodologically. Just in a very basic sense, I'm an historian, and so this book takes a contextual approach. This is a sort of hotly debated keyword, I know, at the interface of law and history, but I mean that in a not too strict sense. But it does try to show, and I think there's actually just a very good example for what the contextual methodology can do here in someone like Hans Kelsen, right? Someone who wrote the most abstract sort of legal theory, and you pick it up and it just seems so divorced from reality. That's the cliche about Kelsen, so removed from politics, from life, so abstract. And I really show, reconstructing it at really some sort of painstaking level of detail, why this seemed like a powerful and even necessary response to the jurisdictional chaos of the empire, right? So I showed that actually precisely that abstraction turns out to be a sort of inverted mirror to the complexity of the world, that Kelsen came out of, and the complexity of the problems he was trying to solve. And so you had to get that high up off the ground to try and order, this legal mess. And so it's precisely actually the sort of apparent timelessness or placelessness of something like his pure theory of law that ends up being this sort of invisible archive, of the experiences that shaped it, in this case, of the Habsburg Empire. And so I hope there's some sort of juice to the contextual method there. But I think in another sense, you could say that one thing that this book tries to do is to, I was very inspired as a graduate student and beyond about all the exciting things going on in sort of critical legal history. People like Antoni Anghie, Mari Koskiniemi, Sundhya Bahuja, so many others. And all of that thinking about things, yes, of course, like, the imperial sort of questions of sovereignty, but also legal pluralism, it sort of tries to bring that whole framework, that whole set of sensibilities, that whole toolkit, if you will, back to European history, right? So there's a sort of a bit of a methodological boomerang there, because, all these Habsburg thinkers and jurists were completely obsessed with all these questions too, and were actually had a very literate and very thoughtful a set of conversations and fights even about things like legal pluralism, jurisdictional, complexity, plurality, the meaning of empire, so on and so forth. And so I thought that was actually just a meaningful part of this conversation we're having in global and international legal history. And yet neither camp knew anything about the other. Habsburg historians were very sort of inward looking and caught up with their own questions, usually quite focused on nationalism. And, the sort of more global legal historians or legal theorists, conversely knew very little about Central Europe. And so the book is also a bit of a bridging exercise in that sense that tries to connect those fields. But I'd say also that it in sort of devoting significant attention to the evolution of ideas, it's also very interested in the emotions of ideas, right? In attempts to try and order, the quest for sort of ordering, the quest for conceptual coherence. And I'm interested in that as a sort of an emotional proposition or an affective proposition as much as a sort of strictly, intellectual one. And so I'm just as interested in the fact that a lot of these ideas didn't work or didn't have the desired consequences. This isn't sort of a history of sort of sewn up bows or things that all worked out very neatly. It's actually a sort of history of the attempt to make sense of the world through these legal categories, an attempt that often failed. So in that sense, it's also a sort of almost more anthropological study of what it means, to be doing public law and to be living all of these transformations in sovereignty.
I said I had two questions. So I asked my first question, and then there is a second follow-up question. And this one goes, I think you somehow already tackled it because you mentioned Jelinek, Kelsen, and many other authors. But I wonder which line of scholarship, or which authors did you really look up to when you were writing this book? And how did it actually influence your writing?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, to some extent, there weren't sort of any direct precursors for this book. I couldn't point to a book and say, oh, I'm going to write a book like that, which, at the time was sort of quite stressful as you're trying to generate something out of nothing. But perhaps in the longer run, it might be one of the book's virtues that it sort of doesn't have too many direct sort of analogs like that. I mean, the person who just knows so much about sort of legal history everywhere really is, of course, Mari Koskiniemi, who's just this sort of prodigious, intellect on this front. And I definitely, learned so much from him. He was part of a book manuscript workshop for this book too, and his sort of expertise and experience was sort of invaluable. And the book definitely sort of stands on the shoulders of a lot of Central European historians too. I mean, there are people like Peter Judson who've just written very important and helpful, overviews of the Habsburg Empire, as well as more specialized studies. But to some extent, its sort of intellectual inspirations are a little bit different from both of those things. And it is quite a conceptual and quite a philosophical work. And so it was also inspired by sort of theories of sovereignty and also theories of sort of myth and metaphor in a more philosophical register as well. So I use people like Hans Blumenberg, the German philosopher and sort of theorist, in thinking about the life worlds that generate theoretical curiosity and so on. So it is I think a true methodological hybrid in that sense, and draws on a lot of different literatures. It's sort of not only directed towards one subfield.
I hear you talking, and you say things like emotions of ideas, conceptual coherence, ideas that did not always work, but then you say legal mass, invisible archives, a lot of things that actually could be placed together, but somehow it seems very challenging as well for somebody who's not from that field, especially. So I wonder, what was the challenging part for you when you were writing the book? Or maybe even when you talk about these things, maybe you can also say a few words about what was so rewarding about writing the book.
Writing books is so hard. These people out there who write like all these books, I do not know how they do it. This was actually just such an ordeal for me getting this book finished. So I can't romanticize that process at all. It really extracted its pound of flesh. I mean, so many parts of it were challenging. I mean, in the end, I'm dealing with a lot of very complex material, and with scholars, from the past who wrote an unbelievable amount. These people like Kelsen and Jelinek, they just write, 20 books, and all of them are like 600 pages of dense German. You know what I mean? You're just sitting there for years of your life, it feels like, trying to feel like you've mastered this. But in a funny way, those things that are most challenging about it, do end up being the most rewarding, because those light bulb moments where you suddenly understand something sort of from the inside and it is all suddenly sort of illuminated, you're like, oh, like that thing that just seems so dry or irrelevant or boring, I suddenly see now, all of the streams of life and experience, and all of the sort of intellectual precedents that could flow into this moment and make that seem so compelling. And, I think we all, well, I presume many of us get roped into this whole line of work because of that thrill, even that drug of understanding, and with something like a book length project, the depth of those illuminating moments is all the more richer. There is a huge satisfaction to diving back into these worlds and actually cracking them, actually feeling like you get it, and getting beyond that surface level. And I do think that's something that really history allows you to do, because you're reconstructing worlds in a very full sense. You pick up a sort of more law school type history of someone like Jelinek and Kelsen, and it is so dry, and it just turns these people's lives into almost like these stick figures, but this is a sort of book that really does try and embed them in these worlds. For example, in this incredible fin de siècle, turn of the century Vienna world, where you've got all of these innovations happening across the arts and sciences, whether it's Freud developing psychoanalysis, or Klimt and Schiele and modern painting, modern music, modern architecture, and so on. And so it sort of wants to imbue ideas with that same degree of sort of drama and excitement and vividness. So that takes a lot of time also on the writing front. And it was a real writing challenge, this book. But the writing is something I care a lot about. It's sort of one of my favorite parts of our job. I guess another challenging dimension was that I had a lot of anxiety while I was writing it, that it was really going to fall between the cracks of disciplines. Historians tend to be a pretty empirical bunch, not so interested in high concepts and, philosophy and ideas. And so I was confronting a lot of sort of just blank, mystified looks when I would, from my historian colleagues who don't really care about, high legal theory. And at the same time, though, I was just so worried that, like, why would all of these jurists and sort of legal scholars be interested in Central Europe? It seemed like they just had a sort of reputation, they would just sort of ipso facto not go there. And so I just sort of wondered that actually no one would find this book. And so that's very scary when it's just taking up so much of your life, and also your career rides on it. I was on the tenure track and under a lot of pressure to finish it in a contained time frame, and it was the pandemic, and so I guess it is sort of what I would say, that writing a book is always such a test of faith, and you just have no idea if this is worth it, if you're going to be able to pull it off. But there's actually just no way to know. You do just have to leap, off into the abyss and keep working and hope. But I think that's actually the process of producing something new. Like it never happens from nowhere and without that struggle. And it is so rewarding then, finishing something on that scale. And, it's so far from perfect, but I'm also like content with it, in the parameters of life. And I find that sort of contentment pretty hard. So I feel lucky that I was able to get to that point with it. I also just took huge pleasure in sort of experimenting with the writing and the form. I have some these funny little sort of chapter intros that sort of mimic, 19th or early 20th century style texts that are a little bit, I riff a lot with Robert Musil's, The Man Without Qualities. And so, the editors of the press allowed me to sort of get away with some sort of fun on that front too, because I very much wanted it to be an immersive experience for people reading it, where they really got some of the flavor of this period as well. It's really trying to bring them into that world. And I enjoyed trying to do that with the writing.
Absolutely love how honest you are about the writing process. Obviously, everyone feels like that. We're just not brave enough to actually put it out there. And I'm so glad we found your book, because it's such a great book, right? Apart from the impact that the book already had, especially being or winning the ICONS Prize, what do you hope now that the impact of the book would be now that it is found?
I mean, in the end, this is a very scholarly book. It's not a book like a lot of public law books can be, that is really oriented, to different sorts of policy outcomes or anything like that. Having said that, like it is about a lot of still very relevant things, not only about states that never quite come into being, or struggle to survive, or have sort of ephemeral or paper-based legal personality, right? You don't need to look very far in our headlines for sort of examples of those today. But also questions of sort of layered or conglomerate sovereignty, everything from, the EU, to beyond. Everyone is debating a lot of these things, and there's a very long history to them. And so I do think this is, in so many ways, also a history of our present. But I do also hope that it is also just for readers, in these different fields, that they get something of, the pleasure of thinking out of this too, both in thinking about these figures in the past, but also perhaps their own experience reading it. It sort of doesn't try and swallow that dimension of academic life. It is, to some extent, a little bit of an unabashed, a celebration of what it is that we do in thinking and writing about things. And so it's in some ways oriented as much to that quest that we all share, sort of, although everything in the world seems to be encouraging us to forget it and just to be thinking in much more instrumental terms. It is about the life of the mind, also in a sort of purer way too.
And if you had one piece of advice for those who are writing a book right now, or if they're thinking about writing a book, what would that advice be?
Yeah, it's so hard because, the conditions in academia are just getting so much tougher, and people aren't writing under anything like their ideal circumstances. And so it's also curtailed and sort of constrained what we can do in the time that we have. And so that makes it very hard. It's not like we just sort of get to pick and choose the sorts of books that we'd like to write. And often, you have to make a lot of compromises, in thinking about that. So, I mean, to some extent, I would encourage people to be unfashionable if that's where their interests lie, like not to feel, too sort of, not to feel the sort of peer pressure, I guess, of certain topics that feel very hot button or very necessary at certain times, because these things do come and go, and writing a book is a very long process, and that book is going to be with you and part of yourself and your career sort of for a very long time. And so the main thing is actually that you really feel that deep substantive connection to it, that it's something that you would want to be thinking about spending your time with, regardless of all of those external things, because otherwise, there really isn't a reason, to do this. We're so lucky we have the chance to have this really substantive connection to what we do, when so many other lines of work do not, but also that, if you're sort of true to those interests, I think you can convince anyone that what you're doing is really interesting and important. And so it is just sort of having the courage of your convictions on that front. And yeah, absolutely, just knowing that all of those struggles are something that just everyone experiences, as you also said. And so it doesn't actually mean anything necessarily about your aptitudes for this profession or the quality of the book. It is just those birth pangs are brutal, and writing a book is just as much a sort of exercise in sort of psychological self-management as it is an intellectual exercise.
Self-regulation
Yeah,
occasionally, I guess.
absolutely. Discipline, totally. Yeah.
Natasha, for the end, um, what's next? What are you working on right now?
Yeah, good question. Trying to get a big new project off the ground. At the moment, I'm calling it Laws of Water, Air, Earth, and Fire: Sovereignty Among the Elements. And it's about the first half of the 20th century, so these trans-war decades, sort of encompassing the two world wars. And I'm interested in the way in which a lot of new technological developments, often connected to these, horrible new total wars, are really challenging for traditional understandings of sovereignty, and in particular, the idea of demarcated space, right? Those classic 19th century definitions of sovereignty stress control over demarcated borders. But if you just got airplanes that can fly over a border and drop a bomb, or submarines or blockades, like what do these borders mean? And so I'm interested in these sort of elemental pressures on thinking about the state and sovereignty. And so I want to sort of connect legal thought to a little bit more of sort of history of science and technology studies in thinking about these new technologies and the material properties of these elements being in some sort of flux in these decades. But also connect it to some questions about nature and environment and territoriality in that sort of embodied sense too. So at the moment, I'm sort of plotting a book that is composed of 4 essays, one called Water, one called Earth, one called Air, one called Fire, ending with the sort of atom bomb there. But we'll see. We're still very much in the early stages of development, but I'm excited. It is a moment where I get to sort of strike out and try and acquire, different sorts of expertise and have all of that sort of intellectual, nourishment and re-stimulation of immersing myself in other areas. Because for so long there, while you're working on a book, you have to be so you do have to be a bit instrumental in your reading. It does feel like you're just reading for this one purpose of your book, and I get to step back now and sort of think a bit more broadly again, which is wonderful.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. We will be following at the ICONS. We will be following, I'm sure. Thank you so much, Natasha, for joining us. Natasha Whitley, the ICONS Book Prize winner 2025. Thank you so much.
I'm so grateful, Maya, and I really am just so grateful to the Society too. This is such a huge honor, and I'm just thrilled that some of you have found this book. So thank you so much.
Thank you.